In this chapter, we're going to introduce IT service management, talk a little bit about what IT service management means as an overall practice within your organization, introduce you to the IT service management lifecycle, talk a little bit about the components of the lifecycle and the lifecycle processes, and then provide you an opportunity to check your awareness of these things before we start getting into the specific details. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at IT service management holistically as a practice. What are the various good practices associated with IT service management? What do we really mean anyway when we talk about services and processes and roles? What is service management and why does that matter to you and your organization? And then we'll introduce you to broad process models and then more specific summaries around how to leverage and use IT service management as a practice to drive value for your customers. In considering IT service management wholly, IT service management is specifically defined as a coordinated way of designing, implementing, and operating different types of frameworks, models, and quality systems. It can incorporate things associated with ITIL, but also other frameworks like COBIT, project management best practices like the PMBOK, and so forth. And what we're really trying to do is produce a set of coordinated organizational capabilities. Various resources that we can leverage and use: hardware, software, people, budgets, and money, and so forth, as well as certain types of processes and capabilities and how we're going to leverage and use those things. And the trick here being that we want to be able to think both in terms of functional organizational groups that are performing different types of work, as well as cross-functional processes that we're going to use to manage resolution of incidents, to be able to implement changes successfully, and so forth. So within that, we're going to have specializations at each stage of the life cycle. We'll have certain resources that will probably specialize in strategic planning, other resources that will specialize in service design activities, other resources managing transitions of services out of development environments through testing and validation and into production environments. Organizational resources focused on operation and support of the services in the live production space, as well as resources and capabilities focused on driving improvements throughout all of those aspects of the life cycle. So what are the critical success factors for fully leveraging IT service management to create real capabilities and benefits for your organization as a service provider? The first key one, of course, is to have very strong executive leadership driving service management, not just focused on tool implementations or process activities, but more broadly on services and outcomes. How is this helping your organization to achieve its mission? We certainly want to understand our current capabilities, both from a technical perspective as well as our existing processes and functional capabilities, and to be able to make meaningful steps based on where we are in order to actually leverage these capabilities effectively. We want to put in place well-structured and well-managed adoption plans, continual service improvement plans, to be able to continue to drive additional maturity through our organization. The only way you're going to get there is with some real clarity around roles and responsibilities, clarity around exactly what it is we're trying to accomplish. What are our specific purposes, goals, and objectives for doing a particular type of service management implementation? And then last and certainly not least, having good, appropriate metrics and key performance indicators we can use to measure our progress and to be able to assess whether in fact we're getting the traction we want to. Let's take a look at how ITIL developed over time. So this was designed in the beginning to be really a best practice framework for creating, managing, and supporting services over time. It began as part of a public-private partnership in the UK in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Is currently owned by a group called the Cabinet Office within the UK government. And the actual components of the ITIL are actually managed by an international users group that actually builds and supports and actually writes the content. Currently, there are 5 books that are part of the ITIL, and they document what we'll call the IT service lifecycle. First, we have a book called Service Strategy that looks holistically at strategic planning and how services are going to be aligned with certain customers, create certain sets of outcomes for certain customers, and obviously help us as a service provider to be able to capture some value and be able to support that client. Service design is really about designing the right level of service to support a particular set of customers, to be able to align the quality or the requirements of services that the customer are really looking for with our ability to provision and deliver that level of service back to them. Service transition looks at how we take services out of development, how we oversee their packaging, their build, testing, and ultimately deployment into the live environment, to be able to do that in a way that helps us get the benefits of those services and be able to manage risk as we go. Service operation is really looking at how we keep services up and running in the production space and provide support and restoration of those services if we have disruptions to them. Lastly, continual service improvement, as the name implies, really is looking at driving improvements throughout all of the other aspects of the service lifecycle for all of the processes that we use and for all of our services that we deliver to the various customers that we have. Now, the ITIL books themselves have gone through a number of different refreshes over the years. They began as a series of 40 books way back in the 1980s. Were consolidated into 7 books as part of ITIL version 2 in 2001. In version 3 in 2007, those 7 books were consolidated into the 5 that we have today, and those 5 underwent a recent refresh in July of 2011. So one of the things to consider when we look at ITIL in general is that ITIL is a descriptive framework. It describes what we need to do from an organizational perspective, from a process perspective, from a service perspective, to do an effective job of strategy, design, transition, operational and improvement activities. The framework includes specific guidance around how to do both strategic, tactical, and operational activity. It provides specific guidance about structure and roles and responsibilities. It provides a little bit of guidance on selecting technology to underpin and support those process areas. The objective, of course, is to really transform how we do what we do every day, from being very focused on technology and cost to focusing instead on whole end-to-end services and how those services deliver value back for our customers. We want to establish a broad array of what we might call a service culture or a culture of service. What we really mean when we say that is I don't just want to think in terms of my technology silo, but in terms of how we support whole underpinned services and how we work collaboratively across technical and functional groups to enable and sustain that service for our customers. In order for us to actually get there, of course, we have to have a structured way in how we're going to create and sustain IT services for our customers, to be able to effectively measure the performance of those services, the relative operational health of those services, and to try to shift some of our efforts from reactive firefighting when those services go down, where we spend a lot of our energy today, to being able to more proactively manage the operational health of those services and sustain them in the environment over time. Ultimately, some of the key benefits we're going to see are real predictability in performance and quality of service, better accountability for the costs and value associated with those services, as well as to improve the overall relationship between the IT service provider organization and its various business customers, and to ensure that we're not only aligned with the business's objectives, but that we're actively supporting those business processes and driving business results. In the next section, we're going to take a look at 6 particular key concepts within IT service management. We're going to introduce the notion of a good practice, talk a little bit about services in general and IT service management in particular, introduce the concepts of functions, processes, and roles to ensure that we have real clarity about what we mean when we say those, introduce the generic process model and talk about key process characteristics, and then talk about the role of service owners and process owners in driving accountability across different technical and functional organizations. So one of the key things about ITIL in general is that it looks to try to identify specific good practices that we can leverage and use in supporting our services for our customers. And it might beg a real obvious question, well, what is it that makes a good practice anyway? Well, the first thing, of course, is that it has to be effective at delivering the outcomes that we want. And the outcomes are going to happen with fewer problems. The outcomes are going to happen in a reliable, repeatable way. We're not going to have any unpleasant side effects of doing what we're doing. We want to be able to do things in a way that's efficient, that makes good utilization of resources, that we want to be able to do consistently and repeatably over a long period of time, and it's been proven to work in real organizations like yours to now allow people to actually perform their work in a consistent and repeatable way. Now, these can come from a lot of different places. They can come from broad public frameworks like the ITIL or the PMBOK or many, many others. They can come from proprietary content, either things that perhaps a consultancy develops to support its customers, or potentially that your organization may develop as good practices in delivering certain kinds of services within your own organization. So the general idea in a good practice is that we want to have a consistent, repeatable way of using our resources to deliver results, to be able to do things as efficiently and effectively as we can, and then to drive improvements against those things over time. So we can think about good practices as things that we're continually evolving and making even better, not so much a best practice per se that has to be left in stone, which I don't think is really real anyway, but good practices that deliver good outcomes that we can continually drive improvements into to drive consistent and more quality outcomes for ourselves and for our customers. In thinking about customers, it's important to think about the relationship that we have as a service provider to different kinds of customers, because it may impact the relationships we need to have and some of the interactions that we may have with them. If we're dealing with an internal customer of a service and we're an internal service provider, the funding is clearly going to come internal to our organization, and the links to strategy are going to be very tightly aligned around the business's strategy that we're trying to deliver and support. Clearly, from a financial management perspective, cost of that service is a fundamental driver. They want to be able to minimize the cost to the organization of provisioning that service, and we have to be able to provide an appropriate balance between the cost of provisioning that service and the optimized level of quality that they're going to need to in order to be able to use that service effectively in the business. From a design perspective, we're going to probably have our internal customers very tightly aligned with the development teams who are building and structuring that service, and again have them very closely involved in working to manage testing, validation, other transition planning activities to ensure that we can bring the service into production successfully. Obviously, when we're serving internal customers, we want to optimize the business value this is creating for that business organization and be able to optimize cost value for them so that they can obviously do the things that they need to do and we can manage the budgets as carefully as possible. When we're thinking about an external customer, now we're an external service provider. We may be serving many different customers in place. They're going to pay us based on the quality of service we provision to them. So they have a set of expectations. They're buying our service because they perceive our service is going to enable those expectations on their behalf. So the key link here is how well can we align the services we're provisioning on behalf of that customer to the customer's expectations and outcomes they want to gain. From an accounting perspective, since we're not actually charging the customer just what it costs us, but ultimately a price based on the value we think we're delivering to that customer, we may not share our direct costs directly with them, and the key objective there is delivering the right level of service based on the contracts that we build together with them. Customers may provide feedback to certain aspects of service design. We're going to document as part of working with the customer our plans for transitioning and operating services on their behalf. And again, our objectives as a service provider, of course, first and foremost, is to keep that customer, keep them happy, and be able to do it in a profitable and sustainable way so we can continue to serve that customer ongoing. In thinking about the broad aspects of service management, it may beg a fundamental question. What exactly do we mean when we talk about delivering a service anyway? So the first thing I really want you to think about is that when we think about services, we should be thinking about whole end-to-end services, not particular applications or particular infrastructure, but whole services that are going to specifically facilitate a particular set of outcomes for the customer and ultimately enable them to be able to perform more efficiently, more effectively, better, faster, cheaper than they might be able to without the service. If there are certain tasks I need to carry out in the business, I want to be able to do those more effectively, more quickly, more cleanly. If there are certain constraints I have, budget and time and those kind of things, I want the service to help streamline the work that I have to do so that I can reduce the impact of those kinds of constraints. And then at the end, I certainly want to make sure that I'm delivering the ability to actually get those results that we're really trying to get. Now, services can come in different forms. I could certainly have and probably deliver largely external facing services to my customer. services that they perceive as services that enable them to perform directly. In some cases, we as service providers have to create internally focused services that maybe we use as service providers to support our own activities in support of those customer external services. And in other cases, in order to deliver whole customer external services, I may have to use internal supporting services like directory services, for example, to be able to enable those external services to function effectively. So one of the things we're going to end up doing over time is creating essentially a chain set of services that we deliver to customers, and to be able to align the underpinning IT and supporting services that we provision that are going to enable those external services to operate successfully. So that begs some fundamental questions about what is it in fact that creates results and value for a customer. When we talk about service value in IT service management, we're really talking about two key concepts, the concept of utility and the concept of warranty. Utility means that a service is fit for the purpose it's designed for. If the service, for example, is designed to enable us to create and print invoices, does it in fact allow us to create and print invoices? And ultimately, if we're delivering a service with good utility, it's going to enable me to do that at a higher level of performance, to do it better, to do it faster, to do it more cost effectively than I would be able to do it otherwise. Warranty enables me to have that service fit for use. In other words, it's there when I need it, there's enough of it, it's secure, it's protected in the case of a disaster, and ultimately I have a degree of confidence that the service will be available when I need it to be available to be able to perform my work. If you take a look at the picture in front of you, utility has the net effect of taking the normal set of results associated with a particular capability and moving that essentially to the right by increasing the overall level of performance. So if my current level of capability looks something like this, by providing a service that enables me to perform that more effectively, either cheaper or faster, what I essentially do is I move my capabilities over to the right, and now it reflects this new level of capability. In other words, the overall performance of my service happens more efficiently, more effectively than it does without my service capability. When you consider the effect of warranty on the overall quality of service, essentially what we're trying to do is reduce the net set of results that we might get in a way that makes the service more reliable. So if this out here describes our normal curve of service capabilities, I really don't want to have really bad services over here, really unusually great services over here. What I would really like to have if I'm the business is to have a very consistent, high quality level of service that we can have over and over again. And so by using the warranty effect, we essentially take this very big curve and we consolidate it down into a much more reliable curve with a much smaller level of degree of change, which creates a lot more confidence from the business's perspective that the service is going to do what it needs to do when the business needs to do it. So there are a number of key underpinning terms that you really need to be very clearly familiar with as we work our way through ITIL and IT service management. These are terms that we think we know and we use on a kind of daily basis, but maybe we're not quite as clear as we think we are about what they mean. So real quickly, the first one of these is the notion of a function. And a function in ITIL is any team or any group of people and their tools and how they use these things to carry out different processes or different activities within a process. So one sample of a function might be a service desk. And that service desk may have a number of tools, ticketing tools and what have you, that they use to carry out processes like incident management and responding to disruptions of service, or request fulfillment and trying to identify and fulfill certain requests that come in from our users. The second of the key concepts is the notion of a process itself. And when we talk about a process, we're going to spend a lot of time in the next few sections talking about this. We talk about a specific structured set of activities that are going to be designed to be carried out to accomplish some specific objective. Processes include roles and what the various roles are working within that process, the key responsibilities that each of those roles is expected to carry out. Again, the various tools that we're going to leverage and use to support those process activities, and any management controls. Think about things like metrics and reporting and dashboards that we're going to use to oversee and govern the process to ensure that we get the outputs that we want. Lastly, keep in mind that when we talk about roles here, we're talking about sets of responsibilities or activities within the scope of a process. So when we talk about a role, we may be talking about it as an incident manager. That is not necessarily one individual job role. Roles used in ITIL may go across a number of different process areas, and you may in fact in one particular job perform many different types of roles in many processes. One of the most important things to understand about utilizing processes effectively to support service goals and objectives is just what the structure of a process actually is. Regardless of whether you're talking about a business process, an IT process, or any other kind of process, all processes theoretically have the same structure to them. All processes have a certain trigger or some small number of set of triggers that we use that indicate that that process needs to take place. So for example, in order to request a change, in most organizations I have to submit something called an RFC, or a request for change model. It may also include other inputs, why we want the change, who's in charge of the change, what kinds of things need to happen, and so forth. And that really kicks off a change management process. Within the process itself, there are really three big baskets of things that have to happen. I must have a process control in place. Someone should be the process owner, and that process owner needs to set unambiguous objectives about the goals of the process, document appropriate policies for how the process is supposed to work, and put in place appropriate feedback mechanisms, dashboards, or reporting on how they're going to govern and oversee whether the process is actually performing. Along the bottom, you see a series of process enablers. Roughly speaking, these are made up of what we're going to call resources and capabilities. To think about resources, think about a big pile of things on the floor. Hardware, software, throw some piles of money in there, some people in there. Largely it's potential energy, things that we could bring to bear to go do certain kinds of work. Capabilities is then what we do with all those resources to transform them into something useful. So this may be how we manage those resources, hardware, software, and people and money. This may be knowledge, this may be process, this may be organizational structure, maybe taking advantage of the knowledge and experience of your people to take the things and make them into services and use them in support of process activities. Within the process itself, the process is going to be made up of a structured set of activities. So, for example, in a change management process, I may have the change request followed by some kind of change assessment, followed by some kind of decision whether there's a go or no go on the change, followed by a change building process, followed by change implementation, and post-implementation review after the change is over. Each one of those activities should be governed by a set of explicit procedures, and each one of those procedures may then detail certain tasks that need to be carried out, perhaps in a set of tooling or with certain documents or forms in order to drive those activities through to completion. We're going to define within the process the various roles and responsibilities, in short, who's got what, and how we're going to make sure that those get carried out, and define the key metrics and measures we're going to use to provide visible feedback on whether the process is in fact working. All processes must deliver outputs, and they must deliver those outputs to some customers, whether they're actual real business customers and users, or whether the customer are really other processes getting information from our process. Notice that outputs from this process may then be the triggers that kick off the next process in the sequence. So in looking at the broad set of process characteristics, we really can boil those down into four things that I want to make sure that you remember for your exam. The first one is that for any process, we need to be able to deliver specific results. Why are we doing this process, and what are we supposed to get as a result of it? The process must be delivering those results to specific customers. Who gets things from this process, and what are the outcomes or deliverables that we have for them? The process must be measurable. We need to make sure the process is being done the right way and is delivering the expected outcomes. And the only way we're going to really know that is if we put in place appropriate metrics and measures to be able to track and manage that. And lastly, we need to know what the events are that kick the process off. What are those key triggers that indicate that the process is in effect, and what are the inputs that then come into that process in order to ensure that the process can operate successfully. Now, there are a number of key roles we're going to be talking about in looking at how we support services and support processes in IT service management. But there are some key roles that you have to be familiar with and be able to utilize, and you're likely to get asked on your exam. The first one is this notion of an owner role. And regardless of whether we're talking about a service owner or a process owner, first and foremost, I have to be accountable for delivering the outcomes associated with my service or process. So if I'm a service owner, I'm accountable for that service end to end. So I might be talking about an email service, for example. And notice I'm not talking about a particular desktop application or a particular server application or the network infrastructure or the storage infrastructure or the service desk, but all of those things taken together that provisions and supports a particular service for that customer. I have to work across those different technical silos, those different process and functional teams to be able to deliver a working service that at the end of the day delivers the outcomes that my customer is looking for from that. Likewise, a process owner is specifically responsible for making sure that we create and execute a working process that delivers on its objectives, establishes policies, tooling, objectives, feedback mechanisms, and other things that are going to enable me to provision, measure, and deliver a working process in support of those services. Now, along with those owner roles, we generally have manager roles. A process manager may have more day-to-day effect and oversight over that process's execution, ensuring that the process resources are carrying out the process effectively and making sure the process is performing consistent with the objectives that the owner has set for it. And then within any particular process, I may have a number of practitioners who are actually carrying out various activities within that process, taking inputs and delivering appropriate outputs as we work our way through a process area. So for example, in an incident management process, I may have an incident management process owner who establishes our overall approach to how we're going to respond to disruptions. I may have an incident manager who oversees first level, second level, third level activities in supporting incident management and incident response. And I may have specific practitioners doing first level support, doing second level support, and the like. A RACI matrix allows us to define and map activities to roles. So in short, when I have a series of steps or activities that have to happen within a process to get something done, who's got what? And how do we make sure that we know that the work is being performed and carried out successfully? So the RACI model defines 4 clear main roles. The first role is a responsible role, or an R. R's are responsible for that process activity, or either performing it directly or doing direct oversight of the work that's being done to carry that process activity out. An accountable resource is ultimately accountable for the outcome of that particular activity. They may also be doing direct oversight responsibility, in which case they may also be an R, but in many cases the accountable resource is a higher level manager who is ultimately accountable for making sure that those activities can be carried out, but may not in fact have day-to-day oversight responsibility of the particular activity in question. C stands for consulted, and consulted resources have appropriate inputs that need to be taken into account. In many cases, they may have certain subject matter expertise or other kinds of knowledge or experience that we need in order to carry out the activity successfully. Lastly, I is for informed, and to identify roles that need to be informed of certain activities taking place, or perhaps who are getting reporting or have dashboard visibility into certain things that are happening. There are additional models that build on the RACI model that include verification roles and sign-off roles. For the purpose of the foundation certification, understanding the basic RACI model is all you're going to need to know, but you do need to be aware, for example, of the differences between responsible and accountable. Responsible, again, really focusing on the day-to-day oversight of the activities. Accountable being the single accountable role for ensuring that that activity is carried out. Very, very important that you understand that for any particular process or any particular activity, there must be one and only one accountable. that in essence ensures that we have real ownership of that activity and that there's a way or someone specifically who is responsible for measuring and ensuring that that happens. So when we look at IT service management as a practice holistically, the big thing that we want to try to create is to start thinking about what we do in terms of an end-to-end service culture. In other words, it's not really about managing a set of routers or a set of servers or a set of applications, all of which we need to do, of course, but about how those things come together to deliver whole working services that support and enable business process. So in order for us to actually get there, we want to take a structured approach to how we launch services, how we maintain services in the live environment, how we proactively manage those services to maintain their availability, to maintain their service value, and to ensure that we're not just delivering technology, but we're delivering working technology that drives specific utilization, specific business outcomes for our customers.